All right, good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for coming to hear more about Workers' Choice. My name is Ann Schieber-Dykstra. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the Mackinac Center. And I love talking about Workers' Choice because it is such an easy sell. It's a straightforward approach to an issue of fairness. A lot of people don't realize that when Right to Work, which went a very far way in protecting workers who do not wish to voluntarily support a union, that Right to Work is not completely free for the worker or the union. Unions still determine workplace conditions and salary for non-members, and unions have to bargain on behalf of those non-paying members. Unions still determine workplace conditions and salaries for non-members, and unions have to bargain, as we mentioned, on behalf of those non-paying members. We call it forced representation. It's forced representation for the employee and forced representation for the union. Unions even the courts have referred to this as the free rider issue, and Workers' Choice offers a middle ground solution. It gives non-union workers the choice to negotiate on their own behalf, and unions the chance not to be concerned with those members and instead focus on the members who do pay them for those services. And Michigan has the opportunity to be a leader in this where it has its authority. It's government workers, state, local, county, municipal workers, and teachers. Teachers in particular are impacted of this because teacher union contracts detail just about every aspect of their day. And sometimes that can lead to disagreements in the workplace, and we think Workers' Choice could just harmonize the workplace a little bit more. We have an exciting panel for you this afternoon, and I'll introduce you to them in just a moment. But first we want to present a video of a worker because policy always affects people, and it's always good to hear the perspective of those who would be impacted by some of these solutions. So if we could just play that in a moment, we'll show that to you.
We see it all the time in the classroom. If the teacher just stands up in front and tells everyone what to do, you don't get the same thing as if students have some kind of choice. People feel empowered when they have choices. So I'm not saying we need to throw more money at teachers, I'm saying we need to give them more choices. My name is Stephen Hall, and I'm a math and science teacher. I love helping young people, I love teaching. I would teach for free, I love it that much. In fact, I do, I volunteer teach at my church. But honestly, I'm in teaching to support my family. And the more the teaching meets the needs of my family, the happier I am with my administration and my contract and my union and everything. Teachers really want choices. Teachers want to have some say in what's going on with their contract. Whereas usually you have a small group of people negotiating that contract, and they're trying their best to represent teachers. They really are. They go out, they get input, and they do that. But still, it's still you have 3 or 4 people negotiating for everyone. I would be willing to represent myself. I don't have a problem negotiating the terms of my contract, my salary. Time off is a big thing for me. I have a family, and we have this dream of going to Disney World at a time when it's not crowded. A family vacation maybe once a year, just 5 solid days. Health insurance, I think we could negotiate a better plan for my family. I'll be honest with you, I love the hospital care, but some of the other plans I think were more geared toward older teachers who are typically the ones negotiating the contract. The administration has the right to choose if they want to negotiate or not. They don't have to negotiate with individuals if they don't want to. So they could just say, hey, you know what, you get what the union negotiated and you're done. And so I don't think the administration is being forced to negotiate with 20 different parties here. That's an option.
At a tough school.
So for example, if there was some superstar teacher like you see in Stand and Deliver or something, boy, he wanted to come to our school, but we need to offer him these extra benefits, okay, you know, we can make him a special deal. But I don't really agree with some of the things the union does. I want to be completely out, but I'm still going to volunteer my time. If teachers need to stay after school to do something, I'm going to be there with them, even if it's a union thing. I believe that if people are going to leave the union, they need to accept the responsibility of not receiving union services. That's only fair. The union is providing a certain service. If you leave the union, you don't get that service anymore. And when people feel more happy about their job, that creates unity. When people become bitter and disenfranchised, that creates conflict. So I would like to see everybody happy, and I think that giving people choices would help them feel happier.
All right, well, you probably recognize Stephen Hall. He is joining us here this afternoon, and we'll be happy to take your questions afterwards. Let me introduce you to our panel. First up will be Vinny Vernuccio. He is our Labor Policy Director at the Mackinac Center. Vinny has been leading the charge on workers' choice, not just in Michigan, but nationally. He is the author of the study, Workers' Choice, Free Unions and Workers from Forced Representation. He's an attorney with a long history of labor issues, including work on the Bush administration. Our second panelist is State Representative Gary Glen. Representative Glen represents the 98th District from Bay and Midland County area and was elected in 2014. 2 weeks ago, Representative Glen introduced House Bill 5829. That is the bill that would bring workers' choice to Michigan. Gary has a long track record on issues of freedom and health care to school choice and labor, including work on the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition back in 2011. And also joining us on our panel is Stephen Hall. He is the high school science teacher who you just saw a moment ago. He works for the Flint Community Schools, and he has been teaching for 17 years there. He'll briefly introduce himself when the panelists are done. And then we're going to open it up to questions. You'll find cards and pens on your table. And if you could write some questions down, we'll collect those and we'll ask those when the panelists are finished presenting. So why don't we begin with Vinny, and you can tell us a little bit more about some of the work that's been going on here in Michigan and even nationally. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ann. And by the way, it was Ann that produced that video, so she did a great job. And Stephen, thank you for starting it and telling us from your perspective exactly what this legislation could do. And of course, Representative Glen, thank you for introducing it and working so closely with it. We couldn't be doing it without you. So thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out on this, gorgeous Michigan September day. I kind of wish we did this outside, but I guess that would be difficult with the cameras and the microphones and everything. But so what is workers' choice? Well, first let's talk about what right to work is and isn't. Right to work simply means that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't affect collective bargaining in any other way. Workers, unions can negotiate with employers over wages, hours, and benefits. Pretty much anything they could before right to work, they can negotiate for after right to work. The problem comes in that unions still represent all employees at a workshop, whether or not the state is right to work. And if unions can't say you have to pay us, but still have to represent you, they call those workers free riders. Now, we think at the Mackinac Center that's a derogatory term, and we like to call them forced riders because they're forced to accept representation or not. But still, the complaint has some merit. And right to work is not perfect. It's very good. No one should be forced to pay for a service that they don't want, but they also shouldn't be forced to accept a service that they don't want. So what Workers' Choice does is it simply says, unions, you don't want to represent people not paying you. Workers, you don't want the representation, you don't want to pay for it. Okay, great, we hear you. You have that freedom. Workers' Choice gives employees in a unionized worksite a choice. You can either be in the union, you can pay the union, and accept services from the union, or not. And you can act like the 87% of the rest of the economy that's non-unionized. That's all it does. There's some safeguards built in because we didn't want to open up Pandora's box with this legislation. So we didn't want to open the door for having multiple unions or changing collective bargaining really in any other way. So you still have one union. They still have to get a majority consent of the employees in a unit. They still represent all of the unionized employees in that unit. So you don't have multiple unions. You don't have what is happening in D.C. where there's possible micro-unions. Doesn't affect any of that. Simply says that you want to be in the union, that union still represents all the employees. Great, you're able to do so. And that union still operates like it always did. Or you opt out and you act like the vast majority of employees around the country that are non-unionized. Now, from the employer's perspective, we anticipated employers going, oh my God, what's going to happen here? Now we're going to have to negotiate all these individual contracts, and it's going to be chaos. It's going to be a nightmare. Well, employers have the freedom to say, yes, we're going to work with you, or here's a contract, and just like they do with those 87%, vast majority of employees, you can take it or you can leave it. So it doesn't increase any burden on employers, but it gives them the ability to say, yes, you're an employee, I want to work with you, and I want to give you a tailored contract or not. So you can see things like employers trying to attract top talent and giving things like merit pay. Right now, most union contracts, they simply say that the only way to get ahead is by logging another year on the job, seniority. Well, if you have an all-star employee, even though we have a law that says you have to do this, a lot of times it doesn't happen. The employer can't say, well, we're going to give you a bonus or we're going to give you a big pay raise. It has to go through the union, and it's one size fits all. And it's not just wages. As Stephen can tell you, it's working conditions. For instance, Mackinac, it's non-union, obviously. I think they like me, but not positive. But they like to work. They work with me. Last year, my wife had her son. And Mackinac's vacation policy is you have to take half days. Well, I work from home. Mackinac trusts me, and I didn't want to have to take a half day off every time I had to change my son's diaper. So I went to our HR manager, and I said, listen, can I take a half hour off here or there, hour off here or there, and not have to take a full day? And, is there something we could work out? And they said, sure. Log your hours, add it up at the end of the year, and that's your vacation. So I was able to do that. I was able to take care of my son during the day, but not have to exhaust all my vacation by taking half days, the first month or so. I was able to have that freedom because I didn't have to go through a one-size-fits-all union collective bargaining agreement. That's what this can open up for employees that exercise their rights under a unionized contract. So besides this one or none idea of only having one union, keeping collective bargaining the same, not imposing new burdens on employees, gives unions the freedom to say, well, you're not paying us, so we don't want to represent you. Hey, and by the way, if we're doing a great job, we want you back. And we want to increase our membership that way by earning your dues. Because right now, unions have to provide those services whether they want to or not, same as workers have to accept those services whether they want it or not. This gives all parties freedom. We think it's a more fair and equitable solution. Now, in Michigan, the legislation that Representative Glen introduced, 5829, it will only affect public sector employees. Of course, in Michigan, because of federal law, that's the only thing that it can't affect. Also, it'll only affect public sector employees that right to work affects. So we're not changing any law in any significant way. We're simply saying that you want in, pay. You want out, guess what? You get to represent yourself. So thank you all for taking the time. And Representative Glen, I think the crowd would love to hear from you.
Great. This is on, right? Thank you, Vinny, and I appreciate this opportunity. And I can't begin without acknowledging a couple of people sitting out there. As was mentioned earlier, I was one of the founding board members of the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition in 2011. And I always said, even over the decades that I've worked on this issue, that those of us who went to work in the Right to Work office, whether it be at the national level or the state level, when advocating for this position, we're not the heroes of that movement. The heroes of that movement were the union members who, while advocating for right to work and this type of legislation, went to work every day at the shop, at GM or Ford. So I want to acknowledge a guy that I consider to be a hero of Michigan's right to work effort, and that's Terry Bowman of Union Conservatives, who was one of the leading spokesmen for the right to work principle and then had to go work on the line every day and face the kind of hostility that Vinny and I have not had to. So Terry, if you would, I would like to give you a round of applause. And I also see out there representing the Michigan Freedom Fund, Tony Knott. Tony, if you would wave. They also played a major role in, if I remember correctly, they paid for the $2 million worth of TV advertising in support of right to work when it was before the legislature. So I salute you two guys and was proud to stand with you on that effort. Just to give you a little bit of history, when I was 20 years old, I was hired by the Idaho Freedom to Work Committee. I remember Mr. Hall said in the video that he would teach for free if he could afford to do so. And I remember having that exact same thought when I was hired to advocate for this principle. I remember sitting in my dad's recliner when I was a senior in high school reading a Reader's Digest article about the Jupiter Chemical Company in Louisiana, where a worker was killed during strike violates, not because he was even not a member of the union, but because he was a member of the wrong union. And I remember thinking to myself at 17 years of age, somebody ought to be out there doing something about that. So it struck me, in the heart. Well, in 3 years, I was out there doing something about that. Was hired by the Idaho Freedom to Work Committee, and our purpose was to pass a right-to-work law in the state of Idaho. It took us 8 years, which by comparison, the Michigan miracle is all the more impressive, because it took 3 or 4 times of advocating for it in what most people would suggest is a more conservative state. But it took 8 years and 4 election cycles to elect a veto-proof Republican majority that overrode the Democratic governor's veto. It was put on the ballot by the unions who wanted to try and overturn it. They outspent us $3 million to $1 million, and we won anyway. Also worked in New Mexico. One of the interesting things is Vinny and I have a former boss in common, a guy named Pat Pizzella, who was a Deputy Secretary of Labor, I think, under President Reagan, but was my boss at New Mexico Citizens for Right to Work and at Delaware Citizens for Right to Work. Those are 2 states, by the way, that we still haven't nabbed, along with Montana. But the run of Midwest states has been nothing short of momentous in terms of Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana, West Virginia, of all places. And I also spent 1 year on Capitol Hill as a lobbyist for the National Right to Work Committee in 1983, and then was recruited to move from Idaho to Michigan by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy because of my activism on that issue out in Idaho. I remember back in those days, back in the late 70s and early 80s, that the case we pointed to was a piece of legislation in Congress supported by a small African-American postal workers union. I don't think it even exists anymore, but it was called the American Federation of Government Employees. And they went to Congress and had legislation introduced because they told Congress, we're tired of having to represent people who don't want our representation. And so you would think that union officials who always cry the crocodile tears about being forced to represent non-members would have enthusiastically signed on with the legislation proposed by this small African-American postal workers union. But instead, the AFL-CIO predictably lobbied against it. Because it's not a matter of unions being required, as they often portray it, when they portray it as a burden on their shoulders. It's not a matter of them being required. It's a matter of them having the unique legal privilege no other private organization has to contract on your behalf, an employee's behalf, against his will, to bargain on his behalf, to legally represent him, and to contractually bind him. He's forced to take the provisions of the contract that's negotiated by the union. And so the legislation simply says that a labor union shall not be required, as they would characterize it, or allowed to represent any employee except those who voluntarily join and pay dues. Those are the rules that apply to every other private organization on the planet, and I think that's what ought to apply to labor unions as well. And as Vinny mentioned, we here in the Michigan legislature have no authority over private sector employees. That's totally the purview of Congress. But we do have total policy-making authority over government employees in Michigan. And so this would apply only to government employees, city, county, state, state troopers, et cetera. But it would set an example. And frankly, it puts union officials in kind of a box because they always complain about having to represent non-members. Our experience has been when anyone offers to relieve them of that requirement, they vigorously resist it. Now, a couple of lower-level union officials, about a year ago when I talked about introducing this legislation, one of them represented the Police Officers of Michigan organization. The other one represented state prison guards. So 2 state union officials, one in the Lansing State Journal and one, I believe, in MLive, commented publicly and positively in support of the notion. One of them said, I don't think that Representative Glen will have any problem from organized labor on this proposal. Our experience suggests, however, that when it actually comes up, if it does, and I'm optimistic about its chances, that we'll see union officials lobbying against it and thus exposing their hypocrisy. They want the power to force 100% of a collective bargaining unit to accept their representation because it's their only argument for saying that every employee ought to be forced to give them money under threat of being fired. And so they will, I suspect, lobby vigorously to keep that burden they're always complaining about right where it is. But I think we may have the votes to pass it anyway, and I think there's a good chance it's going to be brought up. As you know, the right to work law that passed in Michigan in 2012 gives the employee the freedom to choose whether to join or pay dues to a union. Doesn't matter which way they choose. It's a civil rights law because it prohibits job discrimination on the basis of union affiliation or financial support or non-support. This goes one step further in the only realm in which the Michigan legislature has authority, and that is for government employees, who, as Vinnie said, will be free to bargain for themselves. And the employer will be free to say, you take the same contract that we negotiated with the union, or the employer would be free to offer a better contract. I doubt that anybody would take a lesser contract, because if they were told by their employer they had to take a lesser contract and you were an employee, what would you do if you were free to choose? Join the union because you perceived it to be of some benefit. And that choice ought to be up to the individual employee. There are 5 states in which, I believe it's Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Texas, in which there are no government employee collective bargaining contracts whatsoever. So 5 states have no collective bargaining for government employees. In the 1950s, both the AFL-CIO, George Meany, the president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, all said they were opposed to government employee collective bargaining. And yet President Kennedy issued an executive order, I believe it was in 1961, that established it for federal government employees, and other government employees at all levels have followed suit since. But in our lifetimes, even the AFL-CIO and an icon of the Democratic Party and liberalism, Franklin Roosevelt, said they were opposed to government employee collective bargaining. But as of today, there are only 5 states in which there's none at all. Outside of those 5 states, Michigan, if this legislation becomes law, would become the first state where government employee collective bargaining is allowed, where employees were free not only to choose whether to join or pay dues to the union, but also free to choose to negotiate and bargain for themselves. So we have an opportunity to put Michigan on the map as number 1 and to be a role model and an example for other states around the country to follow suit and continue our pursuit of freedom in the workplace. And as I said, I've been passionate about that since age 20, so much so that if I could afford to do it, I'd do it for free, just like Mr. Hall. Well, we appreciate your support and being here today. I was on staff for the Mackinac Center back in 1999, briefly, working on an educational choice issue. But I am proud to be here today as a guest of the Mackinac Center. I thank you so much for your support of that organization. They were the ones ringing the bell when no one thought it was possible, and it wasn't that long ago when to talk about passing a right-to-work law in the state of Michigan, they wondered what you were smoking. And yet it became a reality, and to my knowledge, was the first state since the 1950s to pass a right-to-work law on the first attempt. It took decades in more conservative states, but I think we were blessed here to have the right set of circumstances, somebody who had been preaching the cause for decades to lay the groundwork. So I'm very proud of the work that the Mackinac Center has done, and thank you so much for your support.
I'd like to take a minute just to introduce myself. My name is Stephen Hall. I'm a high school teacher in Flint, Michigan, and I teach math and science classes. I started teaching in 1997, and I became a chemistry teacher because I love to set things on fire. It's my passion, and my other passion is I have a wife and 5 kids, and that's my top priority is to take care of my wife and my 5 wonderful children. And we live just outside the city of Flint, and an opportunity came up here, and to me it was a wonderful opportunity to do something positive for my community, and so I just appreciate the chance to be here with you.
All right, thank you. And we're going to have some staff. I'm not sure if my mic is hot. If we have any questions, I think I'll start first and ask first of Stephen a little bit. If you could tell us about your relationship with the union. You've been with Flint Public Schools, and a lot of people don't realize you're still a member of a union because of a security clause that was built into the contract that allows you not to leave until 2019. So tell me, how is it that this would play out for you? Have you gotten any feedback? I think it was about a month ago that we did this video, and it's now been made public. Have you gotten any feedback from your coworkers on this?
Yeah, I was kind of not sure what was going to happen if I would start getting angry responses from people I work with, and actually that hasn't happened at all. I have not had any negative responses from any of my coworkers. And I think that's really, really important. I don't think that people are really opposed to this idea of giving teachers choices. I think it's really important to give people choices, and so in no way have I felt any negative feedback. And I think I have a very positive relationship with my other teachers and union members.
And I think what's real interesting, I have some friends who are teachers, and one of the biggest complaints they hear about is the regulated pay scale for employees who wish to move to another school district. When you do that, and let's say you have a certain number of years invested in one place, if you want to move to someplace else, you have to start at the bottom of the pay scale. And so it prohibits people from moving, especially if they're unhappy in their current situation. And it doesn't serve the employee well, it doesn't serve the employer, but worst off, it doesn't serve the students. So this would allow some of that flexibility, workers' choice. And also, Vinny, you wanted to mention we have some states that are still considering right to work, and how this kind of provision could perhaps put that policy debate over the hurdle. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and some of the national work that you've done?
Sure. Well, like Representative Glen was talking about, I mean, this is one of the primary objections that unions have to right to work, and this is directly addressing it. And it's not only in new right-to-work states, but across the country, unions are suing to overturn right to work nationally. They've had lawsuits in West Virginia, in Idaho, and Wisconsin. And what the hope is that they do a circuit split. It goes to the Supreme Court. If Merrick Garland, who is the current Obama nominee to the Supreme Court, or someone like him, gets appointed, then the unions may try to overturn right to work on a national level everywhere. Their main argument is that it's an illegal takings, or the government is stealing something from them by saying that they have to provide representation without being paid for it. So while can't say this is a silver bullet, this is addressing that main complaint of representation without pay. It simply says, no, you don't have to represent people that aren't paying you. And going along with one of the things that Stephen said about not really getting much blowback or not a lot of anger at work, we did a poll on this over the summer, or rather we were with a large coalition that did a national poll on this. And the first question was essentially right to work. Would you opt out of the union if you could do so without penalty? That was the question. About 27, 28% said yes, so a little under a third. So you're still talking about 2/3 that are happy with their union, want to stay in their union, want to support their union. But the next question dealt with workers' choice, and it was, do you support this idea? In Michigan, 70%, these are union members, vast majority of which want to stay in their union, thought it was a good idea. Whether it's because they don't want to pay for, they call free riders, or because they believe in individual freedom, 70% in Michigan, over 70%, believes in workers' choice of union members. So we thought those statistics were just amazing. And just one last thank you. AFP, Pete and Annie are here. Thank you guys for all your help, both on a local level and on a national level. AFP has been instrumental since we first came up with this idea. So thank you guys.
All right, this is a question probably directed to Representative Glen. What committee has the bill? What can citizens do to help push the bill through the legislature? And how can Governor Schneider, has he indicated support for this?
Well, I'm not going to tell you everything I know. But what I know is positive. Let's put it that way. It's been sent to the Government Operations Committee, And the purpose of that committee, as Pete knows, is to do one of two things. Either it serves as the graveyard for whatever bills the House leadership doesn't want ever to see the light of day, or because it's the committee that's controlled by leadership, it's the committee you send bills to if you want to have it ready on a moment's notice to move anytime you want, quickly. And we have coming up after the election, we're only in session today, tomorrow, and Thursday before the election, and then after the election we come back after the elections are over, and it's called lame duck session. And so I am somewhat positive about the chances of this bill seeing the light of day in the lame duck session. And I would simply suggest that the governor told me that if I had additional labor-related reforms that I would like to propose to bring them to him later in the year, such as November and December. What you can do to help would be to call your legislators and through whatever your organization's capabilities are to encourage the grassroots, citizens, taxpayers, union members to contact their legislators and to speak out. Not just contact your legislators, but write a letter to the editor. I know Terry Bowman is a prolific letter to the editor and guest opinion writer. Do that. I know Tony can activate the grassroots through email blasts, and so can Pete. But all of you, to whatever extent you can, raise the public consciousness about this. It is a simple principle that even 70% of union members in Michigan say they support. So if legislative action reflects public opinion, then I think we're going to have a positive outcome. And just as another example of what Mr. Hall indicated, and I'm quoting from the MLive, I think it was in the Saginaw News, February of 2015, Dan Kuhn is a former Saginaw police officer, now works as a business agent, serves as an executive board member for the Police Officers Association of Michigan, a union that represents many of the state's police officers. Kuhn said he sees no problem with Glen's proposal restricting public sector unions to represent only dues-paying members. I don't see that as a negative, really, he said. I don't think you'll get much resistance from labor on that. If that, in fact, turns out to be the case, then we ought to marvel if this doesn't pass and get signed into law. My expectation is unions will figure it out, the light bulb will come on, the higher-ups will instruct these lower-level officials of what the party line is, and they'll end up opposing it. But I think we've got the votes potentially to pass it anyway. But your role as citizens and organizations that have access to the grassroots is raise public consciousness, get it in the media, and put some pressure on your legislators and the governor's office to pass it. Thank you.
All right, this is a question I think each of you can address, but I'd like to hear first probably from Stephen. To clarify, no employer would be obligated to negotiate with a non-union member. And in that case, would the employee's only choice be to accept the union contract unless the employer will negotiate? So Stephen, let's say you go up to the administration and say, I would prefer to do this rather than that, and they said, nope, we're just going to give you what the union has negotiated. How would you respond to that? I mean, would that impact the way you feel about things? Do you think you could have some flexibility there?
Yeah, I think that'd be a time to step up my game. If the employer's saying we're going to offer you what the union has to offer, then I would, of course, accept it at first. But then that would be a chance to shine, to encourage teachers, to motivate them, to give their very best, to really step up and to show the employer that they're really worth something. And so the employer would then be motivated to reward them. I think I would find it motivating, actually.
All right, Vinny, do you want to comment on that as to the flexibility that an employer would have under workers' choice?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we do not want to increase any burden on unions, employers, or employees. So, yeah, the employer is free to say, well, here's the contract, you can take it or leave it. And the employee, they can accept it or they can reject it. Or they can go back and say, well, the union's doing a better deal, so all right, I'll go back to the union. But the problem is that now there is no freedom to do that. Right now, it's you have to go through the union, you have to accept representation, and from the union's point of view, you have to represent these people, whether they want it or not, whether you want it or not. So all it does is increase that freedom. And like Stephen said, you know, if you have somebody that the employer wants to attract or work with, they can do that, or they can say, well, you know, these are the standard provisions, go for it. And I know you mentioned healthcare. I know Mackinac is small, probably by comparison to a lot of schools. We have one healthcare plan. If I went into my HR manager's office and said, hey, we're with Blue Cross, I want Anthem, I'd probably be laughed out of her office. But if I went in and did something like, well, I want a flexible vacation policy like I had last year, that's where they can work with us. Unfortunately, the way collective bargaining works now, that option is not available to the unionized employees in Michigan, and this would make that available.
I wouldn't add much except to observe that in the worst case, that's the scenario, in the worst case, the worst that the employee would end up is with the same contract they got from the union. So there's no harm. They might be able to negotiate a better one, but in the worst case, if they couldn't, or if their employer was trying to in some way punish them or discourage them via a separate contract, all they got to do is exercise their freedom under Michigan's right to work law to join the union and then be covered once again by the union contract.
And do you suppose that workers' choice will have even a more pronounced effect, given all the options now and the belief and thinking that school choice is the answer to so many of our educational problems, that principals, school administrations are now having to be more flexible in offering choices to parents, and sometimes it's difficult to do that within the confines of a union contract. Do you see that workers' choice could perhaps work along with that concept of more freedom and flexibility in schools?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gives more flexibility, and that's where the vast majority of the economy is going. I mean, I don't want to say the Uberization of the economy, but it seems like workers today are looking for, more flexibility, able to get ahead on their own merit or able to work directly with their employers if they want to. So, yeah, I mean, this could improve public schools, and once again, like Representative Glen said, it could improve unions too. Because, if you leave the union and say, all right, I want to negotiate for myself, and the employer says, well, okay, you're going to take a 10% pay cut, and, the employer, part of the employer, is going to be a jerk about it, then the employee goes, wow, this union's doing a lot for me. I'm going to go back and I'm going to join it, and I'm going to keep paying them because they're earning those dues. And right now, that option's not available to anybody, and the union can't really say, well, you got to be represented with us or else. This gives the union the ability to say, this is what we're doing for you, and show their benefit.
So, Stephen, do you see that on the front lines? You're a science teacher, and it's a very complicated subject for some students. Let's say you decided to want to stay after school and offer a different kind of service to those students that you couldn't do during the school day. Do you think that's something that you would be able to negotiate with your administration and say, all right, instead of having first hour, why don't I stay after school and we do something a little bit different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the needs of students change, and just having a kind of a one-size-fits-all thing isn't really effective. Every school's going to have different needs. Every population of students has different needs. Teachers have different needs. Just by giving people flexibility and choices, you're improving the quality of education. There's a lot of things that teachers really feel limited by, I think, by the union contract itself. And everybody just kind of shrugs their shoulders and says that's what it says in the contract, but it may not be exactly meeting the needs of what we really need to do. And I think that just by giving people a little more flexibility, that is going to help them to be better teachers and better administrators.
All right, do we have any more questions? I think we pretty much, yes.
Just out of curiosity, what is the average or what is the range for the annual union representation fee for a typical teacher or other public sector employee? What are we talking about here in terms of what that cost is?
For the MEA, obviously, there's local MEA dues, and there's the MEA state dues, and then there's the NEA national dues. But it hovers around 1,000, give or take, and that's built in all three. And there's no exact number, but it's roughly 1,000, and then there's extra surcharges every few years for pensions, things like that. So you're looking at about 1,000, and that's a rough estimate.
All right. Well, I think that covers a lot of ground there. We're very grateful for you to come, especially Representative Glen and Mr. Hall, who drove a long way to be here this afternoon. We appreciate your insight. And I want to mention we have quite a few informational pamphlets. Feel free to take those. That's everything, pretty much. And also, don't forget about Michigan CapCon. That is our news source. If you're not already getting a free email of that, you're welcome to do so. and also VoteSpotter, which is our online app. It is an opportunity for lawmakers like Representative Glen to get feedback before Election Day and for voters to get feedback on what their representative is doing. So if you don't have that on your phone, it's an excellent tool if you're engaged and want to learn more about what your elected representatives are doing. So again, thank you for coming. We appreciate your time, and we'll hope to see you back here soon. We've got just 2 more months of the year. I don't think we're going to have any more of these I&Is for the remainder of the year, but certainly once January comes, we'll be back in gear. So thanks again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.